Aluf Eliezer Marom was the commander of the Israel Navy between 2007 and 2011. Although he was born in Israel in 1955, his parents came from China, which earned him the nickname Chinese. So you have your Cheney and we have Chinese. And hence the joke that even though he's a true blue Sabra, he was still made in China. Among other things, he is credited with rehabilitating the Israel Navy after the 2006 Lebanon War, the interception of the Karine A arms ship, as well as the interception of the Mavi Marmara flotilla to Gaza. Ladies and gentlemen, Aluf Eliezer Marom.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be here today. And at first, I would like to thank the host, the Jerusalem Post, and the organization, and those that organized this very important conference for inviting me to speak here today. Thank you very much. The story of my family is a bit complicated. My father is a German in origin. He was born in Frankfurt. And after the 33 elections in which Hitler was gone in power, he was arrested and put in a working camp. He almost died in that camp. And somewhere at 1937, he was released after he had a very hard time. And they told him that he has to leave Germany as soon as possible. The only country that gave visas at that time to Jews was China. It's an amazing story, but it's true. And he came to Shanghai, and he stayed there during the war. He met my mother. They got married, and they went through the Second World War, and then Mao Zedong came. They tried to come to Israel, and finally the Joint, the American organization, succeeded to arrange that the Chinese will release them. They had to give up all their passports and so on. They came to Israel at 1955 with 6 children, settled in a small village in the north part of Israel. And my mother was pregnant, and I was born several months after my parents came to Israel. I'm the only Sabra in the family. I'm number 7. So now you understand who is standing here. I'm not a Vietnamese or something like that Begin brought to Israel. I was fortunate enough to be born in Israel. Now I'm sure that you want to hear some more details, but I was invited to speak about something totally else. And I'm going to speak, first of all, about the interception of the ship Close Sea in the Red Sea, close to Port Sudan, 1,500 kilometers away from home. This interception exposed part of the new era of military affairs in the Middle East. We call it the ongoing battle between battles, or the war between wars. And I liked and I used the phrase, the secret war. It's an ongoing secret war between Israel and terrorist organizations and the evil axis led by Iran. It means that Israel is facing a new kind of threat that is based on terror and long-range rocket firing that are held by most of the terrorist organizations that are surrounding Israel and Syria, and are directed to civilian targets in the homeland of Israel. The Hezbollah itself holds about 100,000 rockets and missiles. Some of them are very, very accurate, very long range, and very powerful. Hamas in Gaza holds several thousands of rockets as well, some of them long range, and you saw the rockets that were captured in the Close Sea. All of them, including those that are in Syria, are directed towards civilian targets in Israel and could hit precisely almost every target in Israel. We hope that those rockets will not be in the hand of the jihads that are fighting in Syria, because there is a good possibility that we don't know what will happen exactly in Syria, but there is a possibility that the jihad will take over and will lead Syria in the upcoming years. The changes that the Middle East is going through are a very long story, and I will try to squeeze it in about 15 minutes. At first, I think, and it's very important to understand that, after the Yom Kippur War and several other wars, the Arab countries realized that the state of Israel, due to its strong military force, is a fact in the Middle East. And they understood that they won't be able to wipe us out of the map and throw us to the sea. Therefore, some countries decided to sign peace treaties with Israel, like Egypt, Jordan. Syria was considering once such kind of a peace treaty. And Syria and terrorist organizations understood that since you can't wipe out Israel from the map, you need to change strategy. And they decided to change strategy. They are not going to invade Israel, but they will threaten Israel with hundreds of thousands of rockets that could hit and target every place in Israel, including long-range missiles that were held by the Syrians. They are still holding part of them with chemical weapons that could be very harmful if they would fall in Israel and hit civilian targets. They are targeting the most weak part of Israel, and Israel has some weaknesses. One of them is our homeland. And we are very, very sensitive for civilians that are being hurt by terrorist rocket attack. The threat of invading Israel was, with thousands of tanks, was almost disappeared. Another very important part is a new player came into the scene. The new player is Iran. Especially after the first Lebanon war, after the disappearance of Saddam Hussein, Iran started predominating the Middle East. And the first thing they done was equipping the terrorist organizations that are surrounding Israel in the first tier with thousands of rockets that were fired in different incidents towards civilian targets in Israel. Iran created and facilitated a huge smuggling system that is smuggling weapons into the territories that are close to Israel on a day-by-day basis. The Al-Quds organization is leading this effort of Iran, And in the past 15 years, Iran is deeply involved in the conflict in the Middle East. While setting a nuclear program that will finally allow Iran to hold nuclear weapons, Iran is building with the terrorist organizations that are surrounding Israel and Syria a very powerful conventional threat based on long-range, accurate, and very powerful rockets and missiles, and at the same time smuggling high-quality weapon systems such as anti-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, anti-tank missiles, and very long-range rockets and missiles to those organizations. The idea behind smuggling those big amounts of weapons is to try and paralyze the capabilities of the IDF with those weapons and to be able to target Israeli home front with the long-range rockets at the same time. Israel decided to confront those attempts, and it had adjusted the defense force, especially the intelligence organizations and the IDF. The military forces had to go through an adaptation process so that they would be able to identify and confront those Iranian smuggling attempts without getting into war. This is very important. The idea is to try and confront without escalating the situation and going into war. The battle against the arms smuggling is an ongoing battle. It is an investment that Israel is making in order to prevent the efforts of Iran and to lower the threat level. I will try during the short time I have to say a few words about changes that the military of Israel and the intelligence organizations went through. The first one, we had a very important need of a new intelligence infrastructure and new capabilities. We needed intelligence very far away from home. Those are capabilities that usually are held by superpowers. We shouldn't be mistaken. Israel is still a very small country with limited sources or resources, and at the end of the day, we had to build new infrastructure. The example of the Close Sea, the ship that was stopped in the Red Sea, says almost all. You can imagine rockets that were produced in Syria flew from Damascus to Tehran. From Tehran, they were sent to Bandar Abbas. Bandar Abbas, they were loaded with cement that camouflaged the rockets in containers, loaded on a ship on the Close Sea. Then the ship sailed to El-Qudsir in Iraq. They loaded some more containers. This was the deception. They changed the manifest, the cargo manifest of the ship so that it will look like that all the cargo was loaded in Iraq. Iraq is not smuggling weapons right now. The Israeli intelligence succeeded during this whole period of time to trace those movements of the cargo until the ship was stopped, intercepted, and halted by the Israeli commandos in the Red Sea. This capability was not in the hands of Israel. In 2002, when I commanded the operation of intercepting the Karin A. The Karin A left Iran, and we did not have a clue where the ship is. We had to be based on dead reckoning and to try and find the ship we had to be based on our good friends, the United States, that gave us some idea about where the ship is. We had luck with the Carine A, because if it would be like the Clause C, it would probably succeed. But the mistake that was done at that time was that the PLO purchased the ship. And the PLO was under the focus of our intelligence organizations. And therefore, the Carine A was traced through the PLO, but the whole movements that were done in Iran were hardly traced, and therefore we suffered from lack of intelligence. And at the end of the day, we had to be based on the operational capabilities of the Israeli Navy and the Israeli commandos. This infrastructure was built at the past 15 years, and today we are in a different situation. This is the intelligence. The operational side, you could see the Israeli Navy operating with corvettes, missile boats, and very powerful Navy SEAL troops in the Red Sea, 1,500 kilometers away from home. This is due to the infrastructure that was built in the past 10 years by the Israeli Navy, understanding that the Red Sea is a very, very important operation arena, and we will have to operate in the Red Sea. If we look at the operation of the Carine A, that was just 12 years ago, we find that the infrastructure in the Red Sea, the operational infrastructure, was poor. We did not have missile boats, we did not have motherships, and we did not have the capability to sail that far. So what we did, we improvised. We took a tugboat and we made it our tanker so that it will be able to refuel our boats. And we took the commandos and we sailed directly at sea, 250 miles towards the interception point and 250 miles back in a very rough sea without missile boat and without boats and without corvettes and without motherships. This shows those two examples of the intelligence and the operation shows that the IDF had lots of lessons learned and decided to make the changes. Building new infrastructure and going into huge changes is not natural to any organization. Many of you know it very well. It requires, first of all, vision. And secondly, a very strong leadership to impose, to do those changes and to carry them out. The process is still underway, and the IDF is in the middle of the process, but is ready to do changes, and those changes are going to be done in the upcoming year. Along the past years, we hear from time to time that a convoy or a warehouse or weapons that were supposed to be smuggled to the Hezbollah, to the Hamas, to the Jihad, to all the terrorist organizations that are surrounding Israel, were attacked, and somehow Israel was alleged to the responsibility of those attacks. The attacks were always very precise, and the targets always were exactly destroyed. The foreign media accused Israel, alleged Israel, for carrying out those attacks, and Israel never took responsibility. The important part is that those attacks, if they were done by Israel, I don't know, maybe by the Holy Spirit, were based on very high level of intelligence and very high operational capabilities, and it never escalated to a war. Both sides had an interest to deny, and there was no escalation. Every time that Israel captures a ship that came from Iran, Iran denies any involvement. This is Iran, and we must understand the nature of Iran and the way Iran is operating. Iran is today predominating and leading the smuggling, I would say, industry in the Middle East, and without any problem, they just look directly to the camera and say, we don't have anything to do with those smuggling. This is Iran that the world is today very impressed, from the smiling of the President Rouhani and the Foreign Minister Zarif. This is Iran that the world today is negotiating with Iran about its nuclear capabilities. We must understand that Iran is a very, very dangerous country. At the same time, they smile at your face. At the same time, without any problem, they'll use denies, they will use lies, and they will continue their program until they will be able to hold nuclear weapons. I hope that this will never happen. As you see, I tried in a very